Ich begrüße Sie herzlich zum Ateliergespräch Anthropozän anlässlich einer Opernproduktion von Scottish Opera, die am Theatre Royal im Jänner 2019 uraufgeführt wurde und vom Landestheater Salzburg als österreichische Erstaufführung bereits in der vergangenen Saison gezeigt werden sollte und nun abermals Corona-bedingt verschoben wurde. Es geht um eine Forschungsexpedition ins Polareis und die extremen Bedingungen, denen die Crew ausgesetzt wird, als das Forschungsschiff im arktischen Eis gefangen ist und ein sensationeller Fund gemacht wird. In die reale Welt bricht etwas Mysteriöses, das dem Expeditionsteam zu schaffen macht. Nicht nur was den Klimawandel und dessen Auswirkungen auf die Menschheit angeht, sondern was die Beziehungsgefüge ganz normaler Menschen betrifft, wenn sie derart hart auf die Probe gestellt werden. Denn es geht wie immer in der Oper um große Emotionen, um Liebe, Loyalität, Misstrauen, Todesangst, Mord, um ganz große Gefühle. Es wird also spannend, wenn wir die Produktionen dann vergleichen können, denn ich widme mich heute der Oper an sich und der schottischen Produktion und freue mich sehr, die Librettistin und Bestsellerautorin Louise Welsh zu begrüßen. So it's a tremendous pleasure, Louise Welsh, to welcome you here. Louise is Professor of Creative Writing at Glasgow University. She is the author of 8 best-selling novels, including the Plague Times trilogy, a very timely trilogy, 4 plays, many short stories, 4 opera libretti, over 30 features for BBC Radio, and she has collaborated with architects, visual artists, stage directors, composers, and many other artists. Louise Welsh has received numerous awards, an honorary doctorate of art from Edinburgh Napier University, an honorary fellowship from the University of Iowa's International Writing Program, and she's a member of the Royal Society of Literature. So it's wonderful to have you here.
Oh, thank you.
Louise, I've got all your titles here sitting on my desk, and many of your titles carry echoes of well-known works. I'm just thinking of Tamerlane Must Die, or A Funeral of One's Own, the importance of being Alfred, Whistling in Goblin Market, and then there's Rilke appearing in one of your books. So your research interests seem to tie in with the kind of books and stories that you write. They are in the Gothic mode, they are crime, they are ghost stories, they are apocalyptic, pandemics is an important topic, there is some science fiction there. Do you get your inspiration from writing from your academic reading and from your academic work?
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me to do this. And the only frustration is that we can't be together in the same hall and the same country. And it's so beautiful to hear the introduction in German, because I've had so many, and so many wonderful times in Austria and Germany and, in Europe. So I feel frustrated that I can't come to be with you just now. Um, when you say from academic research, I think actually it all comes from childhood. I think it all comes from the books of childhood and the books that my parents would read to me and the books that we collected at the library. And we have a very good public library service in Scotland. So the first books that I remember reading were Gothic books, books that make the blood flow faster. And I guess that love of literature has really underlined my life and has really improved my life and made my life better. And I feel that like anybody who has enthusiasm for fiction and for the text, for stories, I've lived many lives and I've traveled much further in my imagination than I ever will in reality. So I have a very strong memory of my father reading to me Treasure Island, you know, which is a book I know that that many people across the world love this book. And I remember a point where we just got to a point where the young boy has been taken to the inn by a horrible man who's going to torture him, and he passes over a black spot to this captain, ship's captain, who falls down dead on the floor. And then my father said, "Time for bed now." I couldn't go to bed. So I think I've been very lucky to take something from my childhood and to make it part of my professional and creative life. And so I still go back to these texts, and some of the texts, of course, are European texts. I'm a fan of Hoffman as well. And I had a great fortune to spend a year in Bamberg, where he originated from. So yeah, the spoken word is why I became a writer. The written word is why I became a writer. I think it goes back to childhood, and perhaps it goes back to just oral storytelling, because my parents weren't people who were educated at university, but they still told stories. And I think the strongest stories that we have come from the oral tradition, and that's what underlines everything.
Yeah, I mean, this expansion of the real world in the imagination, I mean, it reminds me a bit of Northanger Abbey, the way that you describe this Gothic imagination, or probably the prompt is, you just travel in their minds. You've just mentioned the oral tradition. I mean, this is certainly something that is much more strong in Scotland, as in other parts of England. Is that part of your inspiration, or is that part of your love of Scotland? Because your work is so intimately connected to Scotland and to Glasgow in particular. To all things Scottish, actually, Scottish history. And Robert Louis Stevenson is a major source of inspiration for you. You've also written academic texts on Stevenson. What do you find so congenial about Scotland to creative writing?
I guess it's the place where I live, and the place where my family comes from. But I think it's an international country. All countries are, of course, international. So we look inward, but I think we also look outward, across to Europe and across the diaspora. Scottish people were always, sometimes for reason of necessity, we have been travellers, because there's been a great deal of poverty within our country, traditionally, as well as many riches. So that idea of traveling across the Atlantic or traveling across to Europe is not foreign to us. So I guess when people think of Scotland, they might think of quite a small country with traditions, but actually I think we have a very broad diaspora and a great love for Europe as well. And of course, we may come on to talk about this, but not all of our travels have been benign. Scotland has also been a great engine of the British Empire as well. So I guess if you're fortunate, you love the place where you grew up. That's a very fortunate thing to have. And I get joy from the language. I get joy from our storytelling tradition. And I guess there's a great love of the Gothic, which again is an international form. But the idea of doubles and doubling, which comes into Stevenson's work, which comes into the work of James Hogg, which some of your students may be familiar with his work, The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, which is one of our underlying texts. Even for people who haven't read it, this is something that underpins, I think, a lot of traditional Scottish writing. And I suppose there's a humour within the darkness as well, which I think sustains it. We're not scared of having fun. So that idea of fun, joy, escape, and a political underlying as well. There's always I think within a lot of Scottish writing, there's a consciousness of how things are, and how the political situation is, and how the social situation is. So I think there's an interesting marrying of what would you call it? Of escapist fantasy, but underlined by a consciousness of inequality and a consciousness of how we might wish the world to be. I mean, really, I'm distilling here because for any type of Scotland's literary scene is very diverse and increasingly diverse as we move into the 21st century. So perhaps that's something else that I like, that it is actually hard to pin down what Scottish literature is. You know, when I was a child, we would be told that Scottish literature was written mainly by heterosexual white men. Well, actually, women were always telling stories. Women were always making poetry. Women were always making song. Our landscape was always more ethnically diverse than was acknowledged. And I think within the 21st century, these things themselves are beginning to be acknowledged, and some lost writers beginning to be refound, especially female writers.
Yeah, and it's always been a point of attraction for many writers. I mean, Mary Shelley spent time in Dundee, and we're coming back to Frankenstein
Always.
when we talk about when we talk about the Anthropocene. How old were you when you moved to Scotland? Because you were born in London, is that correct?
Yeah, so my dad was in the RAF, so the Royal Air Force, and he was a working man who, I guess, joined the Air Force to see a bit more of the world and to hopefully, you know, improve his prospects. So he and my mother were in London when I was born, and we travelled as a family, but we're always coming back to Scotland. So yeah, so I've always considered myself Scottish, born to Scottish parents and educated in Scotland as well. So I think we came back, oh gosh, I don't know. I don't know how old I would be, about 7, but we travelled in that period. So many schools. My parents can't remember how many schools I went to, and I don't remember either.
When you said we've got a very strong sense of what is real, and at the same time a very powerful imagination. How do you actually work? I mean, where do you get the inspiration from when we sort of try and figure out your Scottish context a bit more? Do you go into the street? I mean, you don't seem to be the writer that is tied to the desk all the time because you do so many other things. Do you draw on the people you actually see, or do you read newspapers, or do you just observe people and then there's an idea and that's that triggers a plot, probably a Gothic plot or a murder plot in your imagination?
Yeah, this is the tension within the writer's life, because the writer has to be at the desk, and yet the writer must not spend all their time at the desk. And Robert Louis Stevenson says the worst part is that you have to be at your desk. And I think he's correct, because there's an amazing world out there, and yet the only way to write a big thing like a book is to put in the hours, you know, and sit here and sit. So I do both. During lockdown, it's been such an interesting time. Everybody's been told to take walks. We must take a walk, and there was nothing else to do except take a walk. And all our walks came back home. We were always walking home in a circle eventually. So no, I like to be out in the world, and I like to be observing, and I'm somebody who enjoys to live in a city, and I like to be a part of the city. And I think part of the writer's job is to get into the back room of everywhere in the city, to get into the back room of the city chambers, into the back room of your local shop, to be a part of society as well as viewing society. Because to stand back and look is one thing, but also to experience and feel is something else. So I think we are observers, but I think we also have to be active agents as well, because we have to we have to feel too. So it's observing, but also, yeah, feeling. And I would never, when I speak to writers who are young in their craft, I always say, don't wear headphones. Don't walk about with headphones on. You know, walk about with your eyes open, with your ears open. Listen to the sounds around you and feel what the air is like, and listen to people's conversation. You know, what are people talking about on the bus and on the subway? And so this has been one of the strange things about lockdown, that we're not using public transport in the way that we normally would. Our worlds are perhaps a little bit smaller, and yet you get, I used the word distilled earlier, you get perhaps a more distilled idea of your neighborhood, that this, you come down geographically to a smaller space, but there are still many, many interesting things going on.
When you sit down and write a novel, what makes you decide that you want to work in the genre of the novel rather than just write a short story? And do you sometimes elaborate a short story and turn it into a novel? So is there a kind of transmedial recycling of an observation or an idea? What really makes you choose the genre you work in? Because I think genres are very important in your work. On the one hand, you work within genre boundaries. You use certain patterns, but at the same time, you know, like all great artists, like Shakespeare, you just explode the genres, you just transgress them. And this is one of the really interesting things about your storytelling, because you don't stay within a genre.
Oh gosh, well, I love genres. You know, I like the parameters that are placed on you. And perhaps this is one of the things that I like about theatre, that you always have parameters. Sometimes within theatre, those parameters are financial, as you know. You know, you might have an idea and think, gosh, I would like 3 actors or 4 singers, and you're told, no, you can only have 2 actors. You can only have 3 singers, but that's all we can afford. And so then you have to think, you have to work out, is this story possible? You know, is this story, how's this story going to work? The most recent play I did was it was inspired by Alfred Jarry's Über, and I was allowed 3 actors, but I had to kill lots of peasants, and I had to kill all of the aristocracy, and I had to kill an entire army. And we couldn't, and so I got lots of bunches of balloons, and we drew faces on them, and that we killed them in that way. But the budget wouldn't spread to as many balloons as I wanted, even. So I like that we have to come up with interesting solutions to ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you have an idea and you think this is definitely a novel. You just know, there's an instinct, you know. And I guess I carry ideas around usually for quite a while before I settle down to work on them. So I've just finished a new novel, which will come out in February 2022. I might have been thinking about this for around 10 years, you know, the rough idea before I could settle on the specifics and the way of telling it. So yeah, sometimes sometimes you just know, this is a play, this is a novel, this is an opera. Sometimes it's slightly different. Sometimes you think, so with Stuart McRae and I, sometimes we think we want to write an opera. What is it going to be about? And then we have to talk and talk and talk and talk and think what we're interested in right now, and then just get to a point where you, like the focus coming in, you know, with the, I don't know, with your binoculars. You think, this is it. This is the idea. Now, how do we tell it? What kind of a story is it? And I think those explorations, that the idea of collaboration, settling on an idea together and working out how to tell it, is rather different from doing it on your own. But it's equally exciting and equally as what do you call it? Yeah, it's stimulating, really stimulating. I think moving from one to the other is nice, because when you work on a novel, obviously long periods, as I said, at the desk on your own. you can't really have fun with your friends. When you collaborate, it's more fun. You have more fun with your friends. Even though you're serious, you have to work hard. You laugh much more when you're working with other people.
But as you mentioned, the constraints that are particularly strong in theatre. I mean, you're always facing constraints, not just money constraints, but there is also the venue. There is just the number of audience that can watch the play, especially now.
Yes.
And don't you feel that these kinds of constraints also trigger creativity? Because when I talk to stage and costume designers, sometimes they say, well, the fact that we had no money to buy silk for this dress, we used just gold spray and it worked. And sometimes I feel this is, it's really the constraints in theatre that at least partly account for this enormous creativity.
I really agree with you. I really agree with you. And I think there's very few artists, if they were told, okay, now you can have a cast of 1,000, and you can have all the costumes that you want. And usually I think there's very few artists that can make a success of that actually the constraints, now it sounds like I'm arguing for funding to be cut. Not at all. But the constraints can come up with some very interesting responses, I think. So how do we still make it interesting, still make it exciting? There are points at which constraints can become too much. And so during the current pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, I know within Britain, people are very worried about the rules that are being imposed on theatres. So we have a 2-meter rule at the moment, and people are requesting it gets moved to 1 meter because theatres will not be able to financially survive with the 2-meter rule. They can't get enough people within the venue. So there are points where the constraints are suffocating. But yes, in general, and I think that's the other thing that I enjoy about theatre and about opera. You're working with other people who are expert in their medium. So when you mentioned the costume designers, I love meeting the costume designers, and I love seeing what they've come up with, because I have a vision and they present us with something that is much more. And similarly, working with directors, working with dramaturgs, and working with singers, the way that they respond to the constraints placed upon them is really stimulating. And I think that's the other, they encourage us to get better, because you see the work that they're putting in and the solutions they come up with, and then their ideas lead to another idea in your head, and on it goes. It's really exciting when you're at that stage.
It's a question I sometimes ask artists involved in theatre. I mean, if you had all the money in the world, if money didn't matter at all, what would you do? What kind of production would you, what kind of play or opera would you write?
I like the Greek idea of just doing it in real time, starting in the morning and continuing on. So I think I would always make the money stretch. I would want to do a festival. But I'd want other people to be in charge of a lot of it. Because I know my limitations, and I don't think I would be able to organize something so huge. But yeah, I would worry. I would worry if I was put in charge of theatre in Scotland. I think there are better qualified people. And I guess the thing that I always loved, I love that mixture of mediums. So I like the theatre play where suddenly there's a party and everybody is dancing on stage. I love performances of Chekhov, because Chekhov always gives us a party, doesn't he? And I like performances of Chekhov that embrace that moment. And perhaps it's something that I also like about opera, is that opera often will bring in a joyous moment of dance. Even in the biggest tragedy, we can have in the middle of it some kind of party. And I think we're very able for that just at the moment. You know, right now we're waiting on parties starting, we're waiting on dancing, we're waiting on really glorious costumes. So I wonder if we'll move from moments of austerity to moments of maximalism. You know, when we get these gorgeous painterly images on stage. So I think, yeah, I think perhaps it's coming out of lockdown or hoping to come out of lockdown. I'd like bright colours.
This is, well, going to be the sort of the high season of opera. We've already moved to the territory of opera, which we're going to explore in more detail in the next video.